It's normal for someone to come in and say, I have a strong testimony. I believe in the resurrected Lord. And yet I have had years, if not decades, of a struggle with a particular compulsive sexual behavior.
Welcome to Saints Sexuality, a podcast by First Light Ministries for educating ministry leaders and strugglers about the causes, aftermath, and treatment of addictive sexual behaviors. First Light is a St. Louis-based ministry that is dedicated to helping men, women, and betrayed spouses live free from the harm of sexual sin. In the upcoming episodes of Season 1 of Saints Sexuality, we will be exploring the formation and treatment of compulsive sexual behavior, specifically for men in the church. Today's episode, we will discuss the hidden struggles many face and the challenges to addressing these issues in the church. Joining us for our first episode of Season 1 is Reverend Sean Maney. Sean is the Executive Director of First Light Ministries and a teaching elder in the Presbyterian Church in America. Sean, welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
So before we get too far in the episode, I want to talk about the title of our podcast, Saints and Sexuality. First, we're going to talk about the sexuality part. Specifically as it relates to the church. We are referring to sexuality as the God-given capacity for intimate union between a man and a woman in the covenant of marriage, including the ways that that capacity and its associated desires have been distorted by sin. When many in the church talk about sexuality or sexual sin in particular, it's often in this context of, here's what's happening beyond our church doors. Don't be around it. Don't go do it. Don't talk about it. Don't associate with sexual sin. But as somebody who served in the local church for many, many years now, who has spent much of your life becoming an expert on this topic, is sexual sin really an issue that only exists outside the church? Because we might think, we struggle with lust in the church, but if you are a good Christian, quote unquote, you're not actively struggling with sexual behaviors in your life that are outside of a biblical sex ethic. So is sexual sin, acting on that, really an issue that only exists outside the church, in your opinion?
The real direct answer for me is it's really obvious to me that sexual sin is something that all people struggle with. My view of sin is that it impacts all areas of life. So other than for our Lord Jesus, sin has impacted our sexuality in many, many ways. On a more pragmatic level, just from my own lived experience and the type of work I do, overwhelmingly those who come to First Light are professing believers. So it's normal for someone to come in and say, I have a strong testimony, I believe in the resurrected Lord, and yet I have had years, if not decades, of a struggle with a particular compulsive sexual behavior, most of the time pornography, but others might come in and say it's been illicit sex or prostitution, even affairs, and there's a disconnect in the behavior from what they know is the biblical ideal, but very rarely is there any argument of what the Bible teaches. So I think most come in with a sense of only knowing that this is wrong. God sees this as sin, that these desires for it are wrong, that living out the desires for it are wrong, and yet the knowledge that it's wrong not in itself being enough to break them from the pattern of it, because the desire to be sexual, to express our sexuality is so tied into our biology, how God created us, that once it's set on some of these behaviors, once they start, it's really hard to just stop just because you ought to stop. So for me, I just don't know actually many Christians for whom they're just saying, not a non-believer thing, only non-believers. What stats come out on the church almost always confirm a good use of pornography amongst believers of every level, clergy too. The ones I've seen and I trust tend to show it of slightly less than the national average, and Christians feel worse about it. So that's more of the trend is maybe Christians doing a little less pornography, then feeling really bad, kind of trying to stop, which is good, but not living this easily away from it. If there is the idea that this is just something that Christians never ought to have lived with, it tends to be people who grew up really impacted with a purity story, the purity culture. My experience has been, I find that more with women who said, they're just not attracted to pornography, and they've been able to just kind of not have that type of visual temptation for their lives. They stayed away from it. They live very chastely. Now I think they can have their own sometimes problems with sexuality in different ways. But in terms of that unwanted sexual behavior, the compulsive sexual behavior, it's less common amongst women. I do want to say, even with that comment, there could be women out there who feel like, oh, well, Christian men struggle with porn, Christian women don't. And I'm still speaking in trends, and there are many women who struggle, many Christian women who struggle. And then because they think that's a guy thing, and women shouldn't, especially in the church, they're even much more likely to stay hidden, to feel that they're covered in shame, and they're acting out as doubly bad because maybe men get kind of a pass with that a little bit, but women ought. So they're broken in some kind of particular way, and that's not the case. I mean, there's a lot who struggle and they need help too. But those who I have encountered who have the strongest, why can't men just stop and it's wrong and not do it, generally have been women in my experience.
So you touched briefly on this, that you had mentioned in talking about the different type of people who have struggled with pornography. You kind of touched on clergy a little bit, which some people might find surprising because they think, okay, I can see the lay members of the church struggling with pornography or other ways of acting out, but surely not the leadership of the church, right? The elders and the deacons, they have it all together. That's why they're at the top of this ladder in the Christian organization. In your experience, is things like pornography and other sexual compulsive sins, is that also an issue among clergy as well? Oh,
of course. I mean, again, there's statistics out there on this, those who've done some studies, but I think it's about 60% of clergy say that porn has been part of their story, still a temptation, maybe something that they fall into occasionally. And when you get into youth pastors and younger clergy, it's higher, where some numbers around that are most struggling, maybe even monthly. I don't lean a lot into statistics. I just mostly lean into experiences. And we have all levels of Christians in our community, from any denomination you can think of, that are here because they've struggled. Often the church does have kind of a response to clergy that says, well, that's the line. And, they lose a lot. We have lots of people that lost positions as pastors or worship leaders when their struggles with porn come out. But it's really quite common. And one thing we have just seen is even with young men training for ministry, it's kind of a known issue. They talk about it a lot, which I think is good. If anything, I wish seminary education was a little more focused on the fact that this is in our culture. Most young people growing up with some exposure, it's really hard not to have that. So it's not surprising that they're still wrestling with it to some degree. They want to learn skills to not have it. They don't want to take it with them in the ministry, but they need a little more than just stop and how to manage this in this world. And so we've seen that a lot too, with just young men saying, "Hey, can you help me with this now? Because I don't want to take it with me into the ministry." But it is better to see it as likened to like a chronic illness, that even if it's something under control, if it's been in you, you need to be diligent with it and not take you learn a few things, you had a big, spiritual experience, or, went to a retreat and, had a bit cathartic, giving out. And then even if you're doing great after that, thinking, oh, it's done, I can never do that again. So it still would be good for those guys to be on guard, to know that it's easy to get pulled back in. Again, with sexual material just being so easily accessible now, there is just a whole different challenge with it. And part of that is clergy, they're men, women too in some traditions, but in my tradition, mostly men. And they're going to have the same struggles and temptations as other humans. They're not in a different plane.
So coming back to the name of our podcast, Saints and Sexuality, the word saints has a certain imagery associated with it. Specifically, people often consider a saint to be a Christian who, by their dedication or extraordinary faith and the merit that they've lived throughout their life, they've achieved this higher level of what it means to be a Christ follower. When we read the New Testament, we often see the word used a little bit differently. Paul often opens his letters to the saints in Ephesus, to the saints in Rome, to the saints in Corinth. Paul uses saints to refer to people who are in the Lord, but also people who struggled, needed correction, and were still growing in their faith. And yet, the church still has this tremendous pressure to maintain this appearance of sinlessness sometimes, or at least to struggle with acceptable sins. As a staff member of First Light, but also as a pastor, can you talk about how church culture creates pressure to appear less sinful than you might actually be, and what effect that pressure has on someone struggling with compulsive sexual behavior?
There's a lot into that. Starting off with what's our understanding of saints, and that yes, we're still believers, more in a Protestant understanding. But moving to kind of where you took the question of still then a thought of, well, we need to present ourselves as holier than we are. That I think there's different degrees with that, and maybe a lot of thoughts on why sex particularly. For one, sex just does tie into a lot of our shame. And we see that even in Genesis with being naked and then wanting to be covered. And so it's just very personal. And so I think there's a lot of discomfort that people have, a lot of fear. There's a lot of misunderstanding around what it means to be compulsively sexual, to be addicted to pornography. So sometimes in church settings, there's a very strong concern for safety. And the thought that if someone is struggling with these issues, that they're more prone to sexual offending. And that's actually not the case. A large, huge segment of society is using pornography, and they're not all offending by any means. A very small percentage are offending. But when if you hear that, oh, this is scary, this is sexual, and we want to protect, then a lot of sometimes the restriction around someone who's struggling, that's the impetus behind it, is someone else or other people going, was he dangerous? And so that can add, another layer. And then I guess I would also just think a little bit about pornography. I think there is a growing resignation to it, a little bit more of we don't really know what to do with this. So if somebody does come forward, particularly in a very positive way, in a way that we would want them to say, hey, yeah, I grew up with this around in the culture. I got exposed to it. It's an issue in my life. I really don't want it to be here. Would like help from the church. That there's kind of a thought of, well, we don't know what to do with you. You're too much. If you start talking about this, then all the cat's out of the bag and other big issues. Now we all have to talk about sexual issue, and we're struggling, and if clergy are struggling, so there can be a feeling of, well, I better hold this back. Like this is just too much. It's just too much for my church. It's too much for my community, and most people don't want to be the point of the spear on that. Right? They don't want to be the one who comes that gets all that going and focus of energy around them. So then it just kind of creates a implicit agreement that's just not really polite society. We kind of leave that out. That's a little too much. We really kind of like that in the church dimension of our lives, maybe the religious dimension of Sunday school classes and midweek small groups, that we just kind of have that outside of this, and that's safer, feels more comfortable for everyone, and it's just keep it easy. And I think that's human. I'm not blaming anyone for that, but I think that also does lead into why the church doesn't address it very well, just almost because they don't know how.
Now we are going to transition to questions and comments, the part of the episode where we answer questions or react to comments from the community. Today we have a question based off of comments that we've received from our community. I serve as a deacon in my church, and I'm terrified of confessing my porn usage. I've been using since I was a kid, and I feel like confessing to my pastor is really the only way out. How do I approach this conversation with my pastor and keep myself safe?
Yeah, I guess I would advise this person who's asking the question to come in and talk with us, or a therapist, or maybe even a pastor in a different congregation, to just talk through what does he mean by safe. So I'm a little hesitant to give any direct advice without more of a what's going on with this brother, because what does that mean? Is there in a situation where this could hurt them financially, or people could, it's a small town and they could be ostracized. I don't know. What I would love to see happen, and what I think is the best case scenario in these situations, where for a good reason, either it's due to conviction of the spirit, or it's come out in the marriage, and a wife is saying, "Hey, I really would like our church to know. I think you need to tell pastor about this." Is that they do it humbly, and they do it a little bit prepared. And by that, what I mean is it's not always the best first step. And it could be a very discouraging first step if you're doing it for the intention of, this is going to lead me out of this. Because a lot of times clergy aren't equipped to help with that. So I would actually, in the way that this one has been framed, I would say, let's get you help. Let's work towards understanding the context you're in. Let's discuss who you share with. I don't know if this deacon's married, so that's a whole other issue. Like, it can be very, very hurtful sometimes for a man to get in front of his wife on this, and like, oh, I'm going to go tell, the pastors, and then the pastors are like, oh, well, Bob, we're helping you, and then the wife feels exposed, and no one's supporting her. No one's really helping to see it from her vantage point with her. So to set all of that up and then to say, okay, we do think it's very important. I mean, this is not me wanting to keep things not confessed. And I value pastors shepherding their people. But then say, okay, we've discussed this. How do we bring your pastor in a really good way? How do we take this in a way that's important? Are we in a humble state of mind? If there's a good reason where the church is saying we think the loving thing to do is church discipline here, that we can receive that we have support with that we're talking through it in a very productive way. I wouldn't do it, I guess rationally would be the word, and I'd bring in some other advisors just to be sure that we're setting it up with best case scenario that it can go well. Wish I didn't know stories in which there have been bad reactions or different things that make me a little cautious to just go, hey, Christians, your pastors are all wonderful, go talk. But there are different pitfalls. And not always just because of maybe what people think of with this is a particularly more stern church, or they're going to be harsh, or they're going to overreact. These days, too, one of the concerns is it's so common that in some settings of some churches that the pastors are fine to receive it, but it doesn't really go anywhere, right? They go, oh, okay, yeah, you're not alone. Man, covered in the blood and God's grace, which is good. Preach the gospel. I don't want men to feeling that, again, that they're not believers, right? Don't treat them as saints. They say this is important, but they don't have anywhere near a response that's effective for the guy who's saying, actually, I've already probably confessed this. Confessed back to my old college pastor, but here I am again. And hoping that this is going to change it. And then the pastor not having enough resources. So the pastor might, recommend a favorite book or podcast, maybe say, hey, I'm here. But often men need more than that. And so then that becomes a kind of a point of frustration down the road, right? Like, well, okay, I've confessed to that pastor, but then if we time jump, 10 years later, and it's still kind of there, men can have more of a, well, that didn't do anything, that wasn't enough kind of response to it. So,
thank you for coming on the program, Sean.
Thank you, Jonathan.
This has been Saints Sexuality. Please subscribe, comment, and share to support this podcast. First Light Ministries is a nonprofit funded by the generosity of our donors. If you would like to support First Light Ministries or host a First Light speaker at your church, visit www.firstlightstlouis.org.